She was 20 years old the day the lawyer read her father's will aloud, and she understood, in front of half the town, that she had been left with nothing but a joke. Her father's business partner, a hard-eyed man named Bartholomew Rourke, had spent the better part of a decade maneuvering her father's most productive claims into his own name. And when Elias Sinclair finally died of a fever that took him in 3 brutal days, all that remained legally his to leave his only daughter was a single worked-out silver claim the whole town called the Widow's Folly, a shaft so famously barren that miners used its name as a joke whenever another man's luck ran dry. She had $11 to her name and a trunk of her father's old belongings, and with that $11 she paid the county assessor's fee to keep the Folly's claim from lapsing entirely, buying, as far as anyone in town could see, $6 worth of hope against a hole in the mountain that had given up its last ounce of silver years before she was born. It seemed the last foolish gesture of a grieving girl unwilling to let go of her father's memory. But packed at the bottom of that trunk were her father's private ledgers, filled with numbers that made no sense to anyone who read them, until she did, and the sense they finally made would not only save her life, but hand an entire mining town back a fortune, and a truth that had been buried for years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Sinclair. If you've ever been handed the smallest, least valuable share of something and told to be grateful for it anyway, tell us about it in the comments. And if you believe patience can still uncover what greed tries to bury, we'd be glad to have you follow along with us for the next story. Margaret Sinclair, called Maggie by everyone who knew her well enough to earn the privilege, grew up breathing rock dust and candle smoke in the mining camps of the high Colorado Rockies, in a town called Terrapin Flats that had sprung up almost overnight around a silver strike in the years just after the war, and had been slowly, stubbornly refusing to die back down ever since. Her father, Elias Sinclair, was not a man who struck it rich in a single lucky season the way some prospectors did and then drank the fortune away inside a year. He was the patient kind, the kind who studied rock the way a scholar studies scripture, who could run his thumb along a vein of ore and tell you, with unsettling accuracy, how deep it would run and where it would pinch out and where, if you were careful and lucky both, it might widen again further in. He taught Maggie everything he knew, not because he had a son to teach it to instead, but because he had watched his daughter, from the time she could barely hold a candle steady, ask sharper questions about the mountain than most grown men who worked it for wages. By 12, she could read an assay report as well as any clerk in the territorial office. By 16, she could tell, from the color and grain of tailings alone, whether a shaft was worth another season's labor or whether it was time to move on, a skill her father valued so highly that he began, quietly and without much ceremony, keeping her at his side during the private conversations he had with his business partner, a man named Bartholomew Rourke, about which claims to develop and which to let lie fallow. It was in those quiet rooms, listening more than she was ever invited to speak, that Maggie first learned to distrust the particular warmth of Rourke's voice, a warmth that never quite reached the calculating stillness of his eyes whenever the talk turned to numbers. Maggie's mother, a schoolteacher named Constance, who had come west with her own father's freight outfit and stayed for love of the mountains as much as for love of Elias, died of a lung fever when Maggie was only 9. And it was in the years after that loss that father and daughter grew closer than most fathers and daughters in a town like Terrapin Flats ever had reason to be. Elias taking her with him up the mountain on Saturdays when other men left their daughters home with aunts or neighbors, teaching her not only the practical business of rock and ore, but the deeper patience beneath it. The understanding that a mountain gave up its secrets only to those willing to listen to it on its own slow terms, rather than demand answers of it all at once. He was, by the account of every miner who ever worked under him, an unusually gentle man for the business he was in. One who paid fair wages even in lean seasons, and who was known to quietly cover a family's grocery bill at the company store when a father was laid up with an injury. A generosity Maggie absorbed as thoroughly as she absorbed his knowledge of ore, though neither of them would have called it a lesson at the time. It was this same gentleness, this instinct to trust the men around him at their word, that made him such easy prey, in the end, for a partner willing to wear friendship as a disguise for calculation. Elias Sinclair and Bartholomew Rourke had been partners since the earliest days of Terrapin Flats. Two very different men bound together by an early stroke of shared luck on a claim they'd staked together as young men with nothing to their names but a mule and a debt of trust between them. Elias brought the patient eye for rock and the stubborn honesty that made every miner in the district trust his word on a handshake alone. Rourke brought the capital, the connections down in Denver, the smooth tongue that could talk a banker into extending credit, or a nervous investor into staying the course through a lean season. For years it worked well enough, the Sinclair-Rourke claims growing from one modest shaft into half a dozen working mines that employed nearly a third of the men in Terrapin Flats, and Maggie grew up believing, the way a child believes the shape of the world she is born into, that this partnership was simply how things were and always would be. It was her father's habit, every evening after supper, to sit at the kitchen table with his private ledger, a battered leather book he never let out of his own hands, and enter the day's figures in a careful, cramped script that Maggie, sitting across from him with her own schoolwork, absorbed more of than either of them ever discussed aloud. She noticed, even as a girl, that her father kept two sets of numbers for certain claims, the official production figures that went to Rourke and the territorial recorder, and a private column beside them that never seemed to match exactly, and when she once asked him why, he only smiled in the tired, careful way he had and told her that a wise man kept his own true accounting close to his chest. Because paper trusted to the wrong hands had a way of becoming a weapon instead of a record. She did not understand then how prophetic that lesson would prove to be, nor how much her father already suspected about the man he called his partner and his friend. The trouble that would eventually cost Elias Sinclair everything began, as Maggie would only fully understand years later. In the winter she turned 17, when a shaft on one of the partnership's most productive claims, a mine called the Cormorant, collapsed during a night shift and killed two miners, a father and his young nephew, who had only taken the job that same week. The territorial inspector who came to examine the wreckage found evidence that the timber shoring in the lower gallery had been old and improperly reinforced, cut corners that should never have been cut in a mine, producing the kind of returns the Cormorant was reporting on paper. Elias was beside himself with grief and guilt, certain the fault lay somewhere in decisions made about the mine's upkeep, and he began, in the weeks that followed, quietly investigating the Cormorant's accounts himself. Comparing what had actually been spent on timber and safety works against what Rourke's official ledgers claimed had been spent. What he found, though he never spoke the full truth of it aloud to anyone but the private pages of his own ledger, was that Bartholomew Rourke had for years been skimming the maintenance budgets of their most productive mines, pocketing the difference through a chain of paper transactions routed through a Denver bank, and covering the shortfall in reported profits by quietly manipulating the assay figures on several of the partnership's lesser claims to make them appear more productive than they truly were. A fraud elaborate enough to fool investors, and even, for a time, Elias himself. The deaths at the Cormorant, Elias came to believe with a grief that aged him 10 years in a single season, were the direct and terrible cost of his partner's greed. And from that winter forward something in him changed, hardened, though he moved carefully, telling no one, gathering proof in that private column of his ledger. Biding his time the way he had always bided time over a promising vein. Waiting for the moment he would be strong enough, and certain enough, to bring the whole rotten structure down, without also bringing down the livelihoods of every honest miner who depended on those claims for wages. Maggie remembered, though she had not understood it at the time, the particular quiet that settled over her father in the months after the collapse. The way he began locking his ledger in a small strongbox each night instead of leaving it openly on the kitchen table as he always had. The way he took to riding out alone on Sundays to claims he would not name even to her. And the way he began, very deliberately, distancing himself from Rourke's company at the very moment the town assumed the two men's partnership had never been stronger. Rourke's public generosity toward the grieving mining families serving, Elias came to suspect, as much to quiet suspicion as to ease genuine sorrow. It was a dangerous game for a man of Elias's plain and honest temperament to play, pretending trust he no longer felt, and Maggie sometimes wondered, in the years after his death, whether the strain of that pretense had worn down whatever reserves of health might otherwise have carried him through the fever that finally took him. He never got that moment. The fever that took Elias Sinclair came on suddenly in the autumn Maggie turned 20, a wasting sickness that swept through several of the mining camps that season, and it moved through her father's body with a cruelty that left barely 3 days between his first complaint of chills and the morning she found him gone, cold in his bed, his private ledger still tucked beneath his pillow, where he had taken to keeping it in those final anxious months. Grief alone would have been burden enough for a young woman with no mother living and no brothers to share the weight. But grief was only the beginning of what followed. Bartholomew Rourke. It emerged within days of the funeral, had spent the better part of 2 years quietly restructuring the partnership's legal papers. Using powers of attorney Elias had signed in good faith during an earlier illness years before, and never thought to revoke, to gradually shift controlling interest in every productive claim into Rourke's own name alone. The will Elias left, drawn up hastily during that same earlier illness, and never properly updated in the busy, uneasy years since, named Maggie sole heir to whatever claims still bore the Sinclair name outright, which by the time the lawyer finished reading it aloud in the crowded back room of the assay office, amounted to exactly one worthless, worked-out shaft on the mountain's north face that Elias had staked in his very first season, and never developed beyond a shallow, barren tunnel the whole town had long ago nicknamed the Widow's Folly, a name that felt, to Maggie, cruelly appropriate to the moment she heard it read out as her entire inheritance. Rourke, for his part, played the grieving partner beautifully in front of the assembled town, expressing sorrow at how little poor Elias had left his devoted daughter, offering Maggie a modest clerking position in his own expanding offices out of what he called Christian charity. An offer she understood immediately, watching the careful stillness behind his eyes, as nothing more than an attempt to keep her close enough to control, and far enough from her father's true ledgers to never learn what they contained. She refused him, as her instincts insisted she must, and watched the polite mask slip for just a moment into something colder before Rourke recovered his warmth and told her, with a small, unbothered shrug, that pride made a poor substitute for a living wage. She left that meeting with $11 to her name, a trunk of her father's belongings the executor allowed her to keep, and the deed to a mine everyone in Terrapin Flats agreed was worth nothing at all, and she walked the 2 miles up the mountain to the county assessor's office that same afternoon, and paid every dollar of the filing fee required to keep the Widow's Folly's claim active for another year, because it was, whatever anyone else believed of it, the last thing in the world that still bore her father's name and her own alongside it, and she was not yet ready to let either go. The shack that stood near the Follies' entrance had been built by her father in his very first season in Terrapin Flats, and never properly maintained since. A single drafty room with a rusted stove and a floor of packed dirt. And it was there Maggie set up what little she had, spending her first cold weeks doing the same patient work she had watched her father do 100 times. Timbering the loose sections of the old shaft, clearing rockfall from the entrance, testing what remained of the vein with the careful, practiced eye he had spent years training in her. Though every test confirmed what the town already believed, that whatever silver the Folly had ever held had long since been worked out to nothing. It was on a bitter evening in her second week, going through her father's trunk at last for something warmer to wear against the mountain cold, that her hands found the private ledger tucked beneath a folded coat. The same battered leather book she remembered from 100 childhood evenings at the kitchen table. And she sat by her small fire long past midnight, turning its pages, recognizing at once the 2 columns of figures she had noticed as a girl without ever fully understanding, the official numbers, and beside them, her father's private, truer accounting. What stopped her breath entirely, near the ledger's final entries, was a short line in her father's cramped hand, dated only weeks before his death, that read simply, "The Folly is not what Rourke believes it to be, and I have kept it out of the partnership on purpose." She read that single line perhaps 20 times before the fire burned down to embers, understanding for the first time that her father's supposedly worthless gift to her might have been no accident of a hastily written will at all, but a deliberate choice, made by a dying man protecting something precious from a partner he no longer trusted. The weeks that followed became, for Maggie, an education unlike any her father had given her at the kitchen table. A slow and careful decoding of a ledger, written not merely to record numbers but, she came to realize, to hide a second truth beneath the first, in the same private language of columns and cross-references her father had used all her life without her ever suspecting it might one day need to be read as a code rather than a simple record. She found, scattered through years of ordinary entries, small irregularities that meant nothing on their own but formed. Once she began charting them against dates and locations on a map of the district she pinned to her cabin wall, a clear and deliberate pattern, on 9 separate occasions over 4 years. Her father had recorded modest survey expenses against the widow's Folly claim that did not match any work she could find evidence of on the surface. Expenses that, cross-referenced against Rourke's own official ledgers, which Maggie was able to examine at the assay office under the guise of settling her father's estate, corresponded to no activity the partnership had ever reported to investors at all. It took her the better part of a month, working by lamplight after long days clearing rock from the old shaft, to understand what her father had actually done. Quietly, patiently, in the years following the Cormorant disaster, Elias Sinclair had used his own money and his own careful surveying, entirely separate from the partnership's official activities, to sink a narrow secondary exploration at it from the Folly's original shaft, following a vein his instincts told him ran far richer than anything the partnership's public claims had yet found. And he had done it in complete secrecy, recording the true costs only in his private ledger, precisely because he no longer trusted Bartholomew Rourke with knowledge of anything valuable that might still be found on Sinclair land. Deeper in the ledger, in entries clustered in the final year of her father's life, Maggie found the fuller shape of what he had discovered and why he had hidden it so carefully. The secondary audit, driven at an angle almost no other miner in the district would have thought to try, had struck what her father's private notes called, with uncharacteristic excitement breaking through his usually flat, careful prose, the richest vein he had encountered in 30 years of working these mountains, a deposit that ran, by his own careful assay, considerably deeper and purer than anything the Cormorant or any of the partnership's other claims had ever produced. he had not reported it. He had not developed it further. Instead, in an entry dated only 2 months before his death, he had written that he intended, once he found the strength and the proof to finally expose what Rourke had done to cause the cormorant collapse and the deaths of the 2 miners buried because of it, to use the new vein's proceeds not to enrich himself further, but to establish a permanent relief fund for the widows and orphans of Terrapin Flats' mining families, a fund entirely outside Rourke's control, administered by the town itself, so that no single greedy man could ever again let corner-cut timber cost a family its breadwinner, without consequence or restitution. He had run out of time to do it himself. He had left it, whether he fully intended to or not, to his daughter, wrapped inside a supposedly worthless claim that a grieving man's enemies had been all too happy to let her have. Maggie did not simply trust the ledger's word for what it described. She went looking for the secondary at it itself, spending 3 days combing the Folly's oldest workings with a lantern and her father's own surveying tools before she found it. A narrow, carefully concealed opening behind a false wall of loose shoring timber near the back of the original shaft, built with a craftsman's care to look, to any casual eye, like nothing more than an old support brace gone slightly crooked with age. Behind it, the passage her father had driven ran further and deeper than she expected. The air inside close and mineral sweet in the particular way that told an experienced ear it had not been disturbed in some time. And when her lantern light finally fell across the vein itself, exposed along nearly 30 feet of tunnel wall in a ribbon of dark, heavy ore, she understood at once, even before a single assay confirmed it, exactly why her father's private notes had allowed themselves that rare flicker of excitement. She sat a long while on the cold tunnel floor, with her lantern guttering low, running her thumb along the vein the way she had watched her father do 1,000 times over lesser rock, and she found herself weeping there in the dark, not entirely from grief and not entirely from wonder, but from something closer to recognition, the unmistakable feeling of finally understanding a message her father had spent his last careful months composing entirely for her. Maggie did not rush to develop the new vein the moment she understood what her father had left her, because she understood, with the same patience he had taught her, that a fortune suddenly appearing from a claim everyone believed barren would draw exactly the kind of attention that could still take it from her, before she ever had the chance to use it as her father intended. She spent a careful season instead gathering what proof she could of Rourke's older fraud, the skimmed maintenance budgets, the falsified assay reports on the cormorant and its sister claims. Cross-referencing her father's private ledger against banking, records a sympathetic clerk in Denver, an old friend of her father's named Wendell Ash, was willing to quietly help her trace once she explained, in a letter that cost her 3 days of careful drafting, exactly what she suspected and why. It was Wendell Ash who first warned her, in a return letter that arrived soaked through from a spring storm, that Rourke had recently begun making inquiries of his own about the widow's folly. Curious, apparently, why a supposedly worthless claim's young owner was suddenly spending so much time and hired labor working a played-out shaft. Inquiries that told Maggie plainly her careful secrecy would not hold much longer. Before Rourke's suspicion fully hardened into confrontation, Maggie faced a smaller, quieter test of her resolve that she would later come to see as its own kind of turning point. A young foreman who had once worked under her father at the Cormorant, a steady, soft-spoken man named Josiah Pratt, came to her cabin one evening at Rourke's own quiet urging, not to threaten her, but to plead with her, gently and evidently against his own better conscience, to simply sell the Follies' claim outright to Rourke Mining Company for a sum that would have made her comfortable for years, sparing herself, as Pratt put it, the trouble of fighting a man with more money and more lawyers than any young woman alone could hope to outlast. Maggie understood, listening to him, that Rourke had chosen his messenger carefully, sending a man she trusted rather than coming himself, hoping decency might succeed where intimidation had not yet been tried. She did not blame Josiah Pratt for carrying the offer. She could see plainly enough in his tired, apologetic eyes that he needed the wages Rourke still paid him and had children of his own to feed. But she told him, as gently as she knew how, that her father had not spent his last strength hiding a fortune from Rourke's grasp, only for his daughter to hand it back for a comfortable price. And she asked Pratt, before he rode back down the mountain, whether he too remembered anything unusual about the timber orders in the weeks before the cormorant collapsed, a question that visibly unsettled him, and one he did not answer that night, though it planted a seed of conscience she suspected, correctly as it turned out, would not let him rest easy for long. Rourke's suspicion, once fully roused, moved quickly and without much subtlety at all. He rode up to the folly himself one raw spring morning with two of his mine foremen at his back, standing at the entrance of the very shaft he had once mocked as worthless, and telling Maggie, with the same smooth warmth he had always used to disguise a colder purpose beneath it, that a partnership agreement long predating her father's death technically entitled Rourke Mining Company to first right of refusal on any new development within the district's original claim boundaries. A legal argument she suspected he had invented on the spot, but could not immediately disprove. Without a lawyer of her own, she had no money to hire. When warmth failed to move her, as it had failed once before at her father's funeral, Rourke's tone hardened into something far closer to threat, reminding her that a young woman alone on the mountain, in a shack far from town with no family left to miss her promptly, would do well to remember how easily accidents happened to those who made enemies of men who controlled every banknote and every hired hand in 3 counties. Maggie, who had spent a full season poring over the very evidence of what this man's greed had already cost 2 families in blood, found she was not frightened in the way he plainly expected, and she told him, with a steadiness she had not entirely known she possessed until the words were already leaving her, that she knew exactly what had truly caused the cormorant collapse, and exactly whose hand had falsified the reports that hid it, and that her father's private ledger, safely copied and lodged with an attorney in Denver, whose name she would not give him, would see to it that the truth reached the Territorial Mining Commission, with or without her continued good health to testify to it herself. The proceedings that followed, once Wendell Ash helped her secure proper legal counsel, and the Territorial Mining Commission agreed to send an investigator up from Denver that summer, drew nearly every family in Terrapin Flats to the schoolhouse for the hearings, many of them families who had lost husbands or sons or simply years of underpaid, undervalued labor to Rourke Mining Company's quiet corner-cutting over the years. Maggie's father's private ledger, laid open beside Rourke's official records and the banking trail Wendell Ash had helped trace, told a story too consistent and too thoroughly documented for Rourke's own lawyers to talk around. And the surviving family of the 2 miners killed at the Cormorant, given voice at last after years of being quietly discouraged from asking too many questions, testified with a grief that moved the whole room to a heavy, furious silence. It took the commission's investigator the better part of a month to confirm every figure Maggie had traced. But confirm them he did, and Bartholomew Rourke found himself stripped, over that following autumn, of his mining licenses across the district, facing restitution claims from investors and miners' families alike that consumed nearly everything the fraud had ever earned him. A slow, thorough, legal unraveling far more lasting than any single dramatic confrontation could have delivered. He left Terrapin Flats before the first snow of that year fell, not driven out by force, but by the simple fact that no bank, no investor, and no laborer in the territory would extend him trust again. Which Maggie came to understand, watching him go, was its own complete and fitting justice for a man who had built his entire fortune on other people's misplaced trust in him. Josiah Pratt, true to the quiet unease Maggie had planted in him that evening at her cabin, came forward during the hearings after all, testifying with a plainness that carried more weight for how reluctantly it was given, describing timber orders he had once questioned and been quietly told by his supervisors to stop asking about, and his testimony, corroborating what the ledgers already showed, closed off the last avenue Rourke's lawyers had left to argue that the Cormorant collapse was simple misfortune rather than the direct consequence of stolen maintenance funds. It was, Maggie thought, watching Pratt step down from the witness chair with the visible relief of a man finally free of a weight he had carried far too long. Its own small proof of her father's oldest lesson, that honesty, given the smallest opening and enough patience, tends eventually to find its way back to the surface, however deeply it has been pressed down. What Maggie did with the vein her father left her mattered every bit as much, in the end, as the uncovering of Rourke's fraud that ran alongside it. She could have developed the widow's folly quietly and kept its considerable riches entirely to herself, and no one in Terrapin Flats, knowing by then the full story of what she had endured to claim it, would have thought her wrong to do so. Instead, she did exactly what her father's final ledger entries had intended, establishing the Sinclair Miners Relief Fund that same year, administered not by herself alone, but by an elected committee of the town's own mining families, funded by a fair share of the new vein's proceeds, and dedicated to supporting any family that lost a breadwinner to the mines, whatever company they happened to work for, so that no father's death would ever again leave a daughter with only $11 and a joke of an inheritance standing between her and ruin. She kept enough of the vein's proceeds to develop the folly properly and to hire, at fair and honestly reported wages, many of the very miners Rourke's collapse had once left without steady work, and she ran the operation the way her father had always run his half of the partnership. With patient honesty and a private ledger she kept, in his memory, entirely in one true column instead of two. And so we return, as we always must, to where this story began, to a 20-year-old woman standing in a crowded back room, listening to a lawyer read out an inheritance the whole town believed was nothing but a cruel joke at her expense. Margaret Sinclair proved, in the end, that her father had left her nothing of the kind. What looked like the emptiest, most worthless gift in all of Terrapin Flats was in truth the most carefully guarded thing Elias Sinclair had left in this world, entrusted to the one person he believed patient enough and honest enough to find it and use it exactly as he had intended. She did not inherit a fortune so much as she inherited her father's own way of seeing, the stubborn conviction that a thing's true worth is rarely visible to a careless eye, and that patience, applied honestly and without greed, has a way of uncovering exactly what needs uncovering in its own good time. That is the whole of what her story asks us to remember, that the smallest, most overlooked inheritance, whether it comes in silver or in something less easily counted, often holds more than anyone bothered to look closely enough to see. The town of Terrapin Flats, in the years that followed, stopped calling her father's old claim the widow's folly at all, and began calling it instead, without anyone ever quite deciding to make it official, the Sinclair Trust. A name that carried in it both the memory of the man who had hidden his last gift so carefully within it, and the daughter who had proven patient enough and honest enough to bring that gift fully into the light. Thank you for staying with us through Margaret Sinclair's story tonight. If something in it stirred you, even a little, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear that patience and honesty still count for something in this world, and if you haven't already. We would love for you to follow our channel so you never miss the next story we have waiting for you. We'll leave you, as we always do, with a question worth sitting with. Has there ever been a time in your own life when something you were told was worthless turned out to hold more value than anyone around you believed possible? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one, and we treasure hearing how your own lives echo the stories we tell. Until next time, stay close.